All right, we've got our batten cutting setup ready to go. I used an offcut. I'm going to use an offcut from the end of the part here because we've already got these two faces squared, but I went ahead and marked them to make sure that I didn't use the wrong face when I was moving things around. This is going to take two clamps. If you just have one clamp, it's going to want to pivot if you push against it very hard. So I'm going to get it pretty close, and I'm going to put my first clamp on. And then what I'm going to do is drop a chisel into the knife line and move the part up to the chisel. And the reason I did the backside first is now it's likely going to pivot on this point where I've got pressure while I adjust it, and I don't want it to move out of adjustment when I do the other side. So we're looking pretty good there. Okay, so put our second clamp on. Make sure they're not hanging over the edge of the face here. Okay, now we're ready to cut. I want to make sure we don't go past our baseline. So I'm going to darken this up. And then I'm just going to put light pressure on the plate against that batten and let the saw slide every time my saw binds in a cut, I find it's because I'm squeezing it too hard. So just relax your hand, let the saw do the work, let the weight of the saw do the work. Now I'm down to my baseline on both sides, but a lot of times there's a bit of a hump in the middle, so I'm going to take the toe of the saw and I'm just going to remove a little extra material in there. If I go a little too deep on the middle, it's fine. You won't be able to see it. So the next step is to figure out which leg goes on this side and clamp it in place, and then we'll put the batten on the other side and do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so I went through and decided which leg I wanted, which face of each of the pair that I wanted to see facing up, and I went ahead and put a French triangle on there, just to make it easier to get the piece in the right place. So the arrow points towards the front of the shave horse, and I know that it's on the top of the part I'm going to see when I look at it. And here's where those lines come in handy. So what I want to do is clamp this part to the rail right where the line intersects the top of the rail. And I want to press it up against this batten. And in this instance, it's not a problem if the clamp is hanging over on this side. We just don't want it to interfere with this side when we clamp this batten up here. I want to make sure I'm pretty tight. Okay, I can pull this off. If you're good with a handsaw, you can make these cuts freehand and just not worry about it. If I was doing this alone without teaching it, I'd probably give that a shot. Now, if you don't want to do it with this setup, you don't want to mess with a batten, the other option is to basically cut just inside the knife line and then come back and chisel to the knife line, kind of like you would if you were chopping a dovetail. Either way is fine, just so long as the part isn't super loose inside the opening when you're done. So I've got it up nice and tight. My square face is the one that's against it, and so I can pull the clamp off here and cut the other side. Okay. eat the middle out a bit. Put one of these clamps back on so the part doesn't pivot. I'll move it a little further down. Then I'm going to make one extra cut right down the middle just to make it easier to clear the waste out. So the next step is to knock the waste out of this opening. It's important to work your way in from both sides. If you just come straight out the bottom, you're going to blow that edge out and you're going to have a bad looking edge. Not such a big deal on the bottom, but it would look really bad on the top. You want to take your time here. Don't try to take all the depth in one pass. We're going to finish this up with a router plane, so you don't have to get all the way to the bottom of the cut. We're pretty close to our final depth here. And if you want to, you can continue to pare this by hand with a good sharp chisel, or you can get out a router plane and finish it off with that, which is what I'm going to do next. I've got my router plane set up to take a nice shallow pass, and that's what router planes are good for. They're not made for hogging out material. That's what your chisel and your mallet are for. This is a sort of a redesign of a Preston router plane. It's made by Walkmore Tools, and it's an excellent router plane. They're a little hard to get, but if you can get your hands on one, I highly recommend them. One thing with router planes is, like a regular hand plane, grain direction is an important thing to note. So with this board, even though the growth rings are running this way, the grain is actually running that way. It's the pores that you should be looking at, not the growth rings. The growth rings are only reliable when the edge of the board is quarter sawn. Then you can just look at the rings and follow them. No big deal. But once you get further away, and this is the center of the board on this edge, and I can look at the stripes, and they're running up in this direction, which is, whoop. So it looks as though the grain in this piece actually reverses from one side to the other. So that's important to note. It's about level on this side, but the grain is running up in this direction, and it's not running the way the growth rings are running. So I'm looking at the actual pores, the little individual fibers of the wood. So what that means is when I start running this router plane into this wood, I want the grain to break out uphill. I don't want to be coming in on this side, having the grain running this way and prying up the grain, which would cause tear out. I want the grain to break out on the opposite side of the cut into the opening. So I'm going to basically just set this thing in here and pivot it into my material to get it started, and then I can just drive it through. And I'm only going to go halfway. And I'll come from the other side, pivot it in. Okay. All right, we'll lower it down, take another bite. Okay, one more drop and we should have it. And to make sure that I don't have stuff like this caught in the corners, I want the edge of the blade to be rubbing pretty hard against the edge of the cut. And that just kind of breaks off all those little loose bits. Hold our part up here and see if it'll drop in place, and it should be a little tight. I'll take that, that's good. So when I do a final pass over this, I'll hit it with a smoother, and this thing will go in without hardly any work at all. All right, so that side's fitted. Before I move to the other side, I'm going to put this part down in place where I want it to be when I'm done. Lining that line up here. And I'm going to put a clamp on it. Make sure that it's all the way home and square in the dado. I'm going to take my marking knife and I'm going to knife where the leg comes up out of the top of the rail. And once we get the other side done, we can transfer this knife line all the way around the part and then go ahead and cut it flush. And I can see from the way that the chips broke out that the grain is running this way because it broke out deep here and shallow here. And it's going to break along the grain because that's the weakest bond. So I need to start my next round of cuts on this side and work my way to this side so that way it breaks out shallow instead of deep. One of the things I had to do with this leg is to, this mark here was on the back side of the leg, and the problem with lining it up on the back is that it drops below right here, so there's kind of a notch. So I went ahead and transferred the line all the way around so I could line it up in the same place that I lined up the other leg. So I'm going to go ahead and clamp it down. Just a little bit of pressure here and tap it into place. And now we're going to make sure we get a nice deep cut on the corner here. Transfer this up. Same thing on this side. Before we can cut the tops of the legs off, we need to extend our marks all the way around. And to do that, we're going to use a square and a bevel gauge. You could actually square this line across, or you could scribe this line across with just a straight edge, but I find it easier and a little bit less trouble to use a bevel. All right, now I can scribe it across. These marks should line up. And we'll repeat the process on the other leg here. Okay, so now we just have to cut to the line. And this is going to seem like kind of a strange setup, but normally I would walk to the other side of the bench and make this cut. But because we're doing this video, I'm going to stick to this side of the bench. I think what I'll do is I'll use this hold-fast hole here. So we'll slide this over, and we'll probably have to go past the opening. So just want to make sure that I can make this cut without hitting the fence or the holdfast. So I'm going to put a little piece of scrap under this. Looks good. Just need to cut to the line. All right, looks pretty good.